How the imaging idea grew. Imaging surrounds us every moment of our lives. We're exposed to its power from the moment we're born. If a parent is a doctor or a lawyer or a soldier and wants a child to follow in his footsteps, that parental image or dream is bound to have some effect on the growing child. Not a decisive influence, perhaps, because at first the image is only in the mind of the parent. But an influence, nevertheless. In my own case, my decision to leave the newspaper field after a year as a reporter and study for the ministry was a reflection of my mother's imaging that someday I would become a preacher, like my father. As intensely as only a mother can, she imaged me as a preacher. She reinforced that image with fervent prayer, and a minister is what I became. So the images that other people hold of us do impinge on our lives. But the images that affect us most strongly are the self-images that we develop as we move through the years. Sometimes these images are positive and strong, sometimes they're negative and weak. I know that as a youngster in various small Midwestern towns, I had some pretty negative self-images, only I didn't call them that. I'm not sure the term inferiority complex had been invented yet, but if an inferiority complex means a whole nest of inadequacy feelings, that is what I had. Where did they come from? I'm not at all sure. My father and mother were both unusually able, strong-minded, outspoken individuals. Maybe somehow I felt that I'd never quite measure up to them, or to their ambitions for me. Or maybe it had something to do with my physique, which was slender and lightweight. I was almost frail compared to my younger brother Bob, who was a rough, tough football player. Perhaps I equated being skinny with being inadequate in other ways. Anyway, it bothered me a great deal, and no matter how hard I tried to gain weight, nothing seemed to help. Another thing bothered me, as it has bothered the children of clergymen from time immemorial, was the fact that I was a preacher's kid. Growing up in those small towns, as I did, I resented this label. I had the feeling that people expected me to be a goody-goody, that adults would condemn me if I wasn't and my friends would despise me if I was. So this left me tense and over-concerned about the impression I made on other people. There was still another thing that may have reinforced my image of myself as an inadequate person. If a guest came to the house or a minister came to call, as was the custom among church families, it was the duty of the children of the family to play the piano or recite a poem or otherwise perform for the visitors. This ordeal filled me with absolute horror. Whenever I saw guests arriving, I would try to hide. On one occasion, my uncle removed me from the woodshed, where I had taken refuge, and dragged me to the front parlor where, like an early Christian martyr being thrown to the lions, I was compelled to recite "The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck," or as much of it as my state of near paralysis would permit. The result of all these factors was that when I got to college and had to get up occasionally in class and give answers, I acted like what I was, the possessor of a huge inferiority complex. This self-image of inadequacy might have gone on indefinitely had it not been for something a professor, Ben Arneson was his name, said to me during my sophomore year. One day after I had made a miserable showing, he told me to wait after class. Then, when we were alone, he said some things that were tough and true and to the point. He said that I had a reasonably good mind, but that I was not making adequate use of it by being so hesitant and bashful. "How long are you going to be like this?" he demanded, a scared rabbit afraid of the sound of your own voice. "You probably excuse yourself by thinking that you're just naturally shy. Well, you'd better change the way you think about yourself, Peale, and you'd better do it now, before it's too late. If you're not able to do it by yourself, if you need help, well, you're a minister's son. You ought to know where to turn. That's all. You may go now." To this day I remember the emotions that roared through me as I left that classroom and went out into the sunshine that lay like a golden rug across the quiet campus. I was angry, I was resentful, I was hurt, but most of all I was frightened because I knew that what the professor had said was true. A scared rabbit. How far would I get in life if I kept on seeing myself as a scared rabbit? Life-changing experience. I sat down on the steps of the chapel and prayed the deepest, most desperate prayer of my whole life. Please help me, I prayed. Please change me. I know you can do it because I've seen you make drunkards sober and turn thieves into honest men. Please take away these inferiority feelings that are holding me back. Take away this awful shyness and self-consciousness. Let me see myself, not as a scared rabbit, but as someone who can do great things in my life because you are with me, giving me the strength and confidence I need. I don't know how long I sat there on the chapel steps, but when I got up something had changed. Of course the inferiority feelings weren't all gone, I still have some of them to this day. But the image I had had of myself was changed, and with it the course of my whole life. As the years went by, I began using imaging techniques whenever I wanted to achieve a certain goal. In my second little church, located in Brooklyn, New York, attendance was low. In fact, one day I found the sexton dragging one of the back pews out of the building. When I asked him why, he said he was going to chop it up for firewood. No one sits in it anyway, he explained. Put it back, I told him grimly. Somebody is going to sit in it. I visualized that pew full, and all the other pews full, and the church filled to capacity. I held that image in my mind. I worked for it with every ounce of strength I had. I made it part of my innovative thinking. And the day came when the image became a reality. Now and then my old feelings of being inadequate would come back to haunt me, but usually I was lucky enough to discover an image of success that was stronger than my image of failure. One Memorial Day, I remember there was a mass meeting sponsored by the American Legion. 50,000 people crowded into Brooklyn's Prospect Park, where the guest of honor was General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. I had been invited, I thought, merely to open the meeting with a prayer. But when I got there I found that my name was listed on the program as the main speaker. A wave of panic swept over me. I had no speech prepared. The thought of standing there before 50,000 people and disappointing them terrified me. I went to the sponsors of the gathering and told them that I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. They would have to find somebody else. General Roosevelt overheard my lamentations. Son, he said to me, stop focusing on failure. You're a minister, aren't you? Here you have a chance to minister to all these grieving mothers. You can tell them how much we love them for the sacrifice they've made. You can tell them how proud this country is of the sons and husbands they lost. So get up there and talk, and I'm going to sit right behind you and visualize you loving these people and helping them and holding them spellbound for the next 20 minutes. I have a picture of this in my mind, and it's so strong that I know it's going to happen. So, shamed into it, I tried to do as he said. And his image of my succeeding must have been stronger than mine of failure, because the talk went pretty well. Afterward, I remember, General Roosevelt said to me, now, you see, if you think you can, or somebody who believes in you thinks you can, why, then you can. Perhaps the idea of the power of positive thinking was conveyed to me right then and there. But behind that idea, and in it, and beyond it was the concept of imaging. Holding the image of yourself succeeding, visualizing it so vividly that when the desired success comes, it seems to be merely echoing a reality that has already existed in your mind. I didn't grasp that concept fully then, but I kept on using it. In 1927, when I was called to a big church in Syracuse, New York, I met the same problems I had encountered in Brooklyn. Church debts. Low attendance. The sexton actually kept a tall ladder stretched across some of the empty pews in the balcony because it was the easiest place to store it. Take it away, I told him. I see that balcony filled with people, not ladders. And in time, it was. Imaging was involved in our solution to the church debt problem, too. The debt was $55,000. It seems small by present standards, but it was a large sum for those days, and it had been on the books for quite a while. I didn't think we could raise enough money to pay off the whole debt, that seemed too optimistic. But I thought we might raise perhaps $20,000. And with this in mind I went to see a member of our congregation, a colorful old gentleman named Harlowby Andrews. Brother Andrews, as we called him, was the wholesale grocer who had the reputation of being the smartest businessman in Syracuse. He had the Midas touch. Whenever he put out his hand, money just sprang into it. I figured Brother Andrews would contribute something and might tell me how to get the rest. Brother Andrews lived all alone in an old-fashioned house in the country. So I drove out and told him we were trying to raise $20,000 to reduce the debt. I also hopefully asked him how much he might care to contribute. Brother Andrews looked at me over the half-moon glasses that he wore far down on his nose. "Why," he said, "that's easy. Since you are not going to raise the whole debt, I will give nothing. Not a nickel. Not a cent." He studied my face for a minute. Then he said, "But I'll tell you what I will do. I'll pray with you." That didn't fill me with any burning enthusiasm. It wasn't prayer I was after. It was cold, hard cash. But we got down on our knees, and Brother Andrews spoke very freely to the Lord. An unforgettable prayer. This was his prayer: "Lord, here we are. We have to raise some money. Lord, this young minister means well, but he doesn't know the first thing about business or how to do things in a big way. He has little faith. He doesn't really believe in himself or in his ministry. Now, Lord, if he is only going to try to raise $20,000, I won't give him a nickel, but if he will believe he can raise the whole $55,000, I will give him the first $5,000. Amen." As that prayer ended, I was pretty excited. I said to Brother Andrews, "Where are we going to get the rest of it?" He said, "Where you just got the first 5,000. You prayed for it and you got it. Now let's get down to business. There's a doctor downtown who will tell you that he hasn't any money, but I'm on the finance committee at the bank and I know exactly how much he's got. So we're going to pray that he will give you the next $5,000. We'll not only pray, we'll visualize him doing it. The Bible says that if you have faith even as a grain of mustard seed, nothing is impossible for you. So go downtown and see that doctor and ask for that money and get it." I went downtown full of qualms and saw the doctor and asked him for a contribution of $5,000. He looked at me and said, "Why, that's preposterous. That's absurd." Then he was silent for a while. Finally he said, "Well, I can't explain it, but something comes over me as we're sitting here. I'll give you the $5,000. I jumped in my car, drove back to Brother Andrews's house, and burst in on him. "He did it. He did it." I cried. "Why, sure he did," said Brother Andrews. "Listen, son, I sat here all the time you were driving downtown not believing he would do it, and I just sent a thought hovering over you all the way down there that he would do it, and my thought hit him right between the eyes." I exclaimed, "You know, I saw it hit him." He said, "It penetrated his brain and it changed his thinking." But this should change your thinking, too. Just remember, when you want to achieve something, hold in your mind the picture of yourself achieving it. Paint in all the details. Make it as real as you possibly can. And remember this, too, you're never defeated by anything until you accept in your mind the thought that you are defeated. You are never defeated until you accept the image of defeat. Brother Andrews, you see, understood the difference between positive and negative imaging. He was telling me that you can image victory, or you can image defeat. You can program yourself one way or the other. In years gone by, a few people had grasped the concept of imaging and were talking or writing about it, although no one seemed to call it by that name. A French psychologist named Peale advised people to say to themselves constantly, "Every day in every way I'm getting better and better." Some people considered this a silly form of mental gymnastics. Lifting yourself by your own bootstraps. Nothing more. But there was something to it. I, myself, once heard Peale lecture. To illustrate the power of imagination, he asked the audience to visualize a plank 6 inches wide and 20 feet long laid across the living room floor. Anyone could walk it with ease and confidence. Then he asked us to imagine the same plank stretched between two buildings 100 feet in the air. Imagination. In this case, the image of falling would make walking it almost impossible. A woman named Dorothea Brande wrote a bestseller called Wake Up and Live. In it, she gave a formula for successful living that she had stumbled upon almost by accident. The formula was this: in whatever you attempt, act as if it were impossible to fail. This was just another way of saying image yourself succeeding. When I moved from Syracuse, New York, to the Marble Collegiate Church in New York City, this grand old center of worship, with a history going back to 1628, had fallen upon difficult times. The gloom and fear of the Great Depression of the 1930s were everywhere. Only a handful of worshipers were in the pews. It wasn't easy to create and hold an image of a dynamic church filled to capacity with enthusiastic people. But I knew that was what I had to do. The night I was installed as minister, there was a ceremony of great dignity and solemnity. My parents were there, of course. Later, when we walked out into the rainy night, my mother stopped suddenly, put her hand against one of the great marble buttresses of the church, and began to weep. "This old church is so solid," she said, "so strong. You've got to keep it that way, Norman." Tonight it was filled with people hungry for love, searching for guidance. You've got to give them those things, meet those needs. If you do, your church will always be full. I was deeply moved and never forgot those words. I took them then as a reminder of a responsibility, which of course they were. But what my mother also did was implant in me a strong subliminal picture of people seeking something, of people coming to the church to find it. She gave me a vivid picture of a church filled with warmth and joy and vitality. That's what I saw with my inner eye, and that's what I have tried ever since to bring to reality. There have been moments of discouragement, of course. But it's odd how, almost always, someone steps forward to renew the image of better results. I remember one night when I gave what I thought was a really terrible sermon. Nobody told me it was bad, but they didn't have to. I knew it was a flop. I slunk out of the church and walked along Fifth Avenue in a state of total despondency. I didn't even want to go home, because I knew my wife, Ruth, would try to cheer me up, and I felt I didn't deserve it. I applied for a job on Lower Fifth Avenue near 12th Street. Was a drugstore run by a man named A.E. Russ, a member of the church and a good friend of mine. The lights were still on, and through the window I could see my friend behind the soda fountain. So I went inside and slumped down on one of the stools, looking as dejected as I felt. When Mr. Russ asked what was bothering me, I told him. "I'm in the wrong profession," I said. "I'll never be a decent preacher. How about a job as soda jerk?" "Mix me a strawberry soda," said A.E., smiling. "Maybe I'll give you a job." So, in an effort to lighten my gloom, I went behind the counter, squirted strawberry syrup into a glass as I had seen him do, added ice cream and soda, and handed it to him. He took a sip and made a face. "Better stick to preaching," he said. But then he grew serious. "Time to close up," he said. "Why don't you come home with me and talk for a while?" I went along with him because he was one of those people who project warmth and caring spontaneously, and I needed him. He told me not to worry about one bad sermon, or two, or three, or four. "They'll happen sometimes," he said. "Nothing to get despondent about. Don't focus on that. Focus on people and the needs they have." There was a photograph of his wife on the table, and he nodded toward it. "It was rough when I lost her, but some of the things you've said in church helped me a lot. You've helped in other ways, too, maybe without even knowing it. You've pulled me through some trying times. And that's what it's all about, Norman. Meeting needs. Helping people. So you just keep on trying. Don't worry if a sermon goes sour now and then. Just reach out and help people, and that church will always be full." So there it was again, the image of a great church actualizing itself. full of people trying to find a wonderful way of life. I remember one other time when the imaging process worked in a dramatic fashion. It was a stormy Sunday night in Manhattan. Wind howled around the corners of the skyscrapers, sending sheets of rain mixed with sleet swirling along the streets. I was scheduled to talk, as usual, at the evening service. As Ruth and I drove slowly down to 29th from 84th Street, I became more and more agitated because I was convinced I would be talking to nothing but empty pews. "This is awful," I said to Ruth. "Terrible. Nobody in their right mind will come out in this weather." I kept on in this negative fashion for block after block. Finally, Ruth could stand it no longer. She pulled the car over to the curb and parked in the drumming rain. "What's the matter with you?" she demanded. "You're always preaching optimism and positive thinking. Now you're just thinking about yourself and whether or not you'll have a large audience." She pointed at the tall apartment houses around us, gray in the rain, the yellow lights of windows shining dully. "Why don't you think about all the people in those apartment houses? Lonely people, hurting people, people who need the message you have to give them? Why don't you visualize them streaming into the church, filling every pew? Bringing their needs and their problems, finding solutions? Let's pray about this right now, right here. Let's ask for the church to be full, not to buttress your pride, but so you have people to help. Let's see it full, and give thanks that it will be full." Somewhat abashed, I nodded. So we sat and held hands and prayed and imaged, visualized. Then we drove on down to the church and, what do you know, we couldn't find a parking space. Wouldn't you think, I complained to Ruth, that the pastor of a church could at least have a parking space? We finally found one, walked back 2 blocks through the rain, and the church was jammed, wall to wall, with people still coming, just the way my mother and A.E. Russ had imaged it so many years earlier. And as we had imaged it, reinforcing our image with prayer. Can it be argued that the church would have been full anyway that night? Of course it can. But who knows how many people who were hesitant or dubious about going felt a sudden impulse to go. Remember what old Harlow B. Andrews said of that doctor up in Syracuse: "I saw the idea fly in there and penetrate his head and lodge right there in his mind." Let the skeptics have their doubts. I prefer to believe that ideas do have wings.